Hi, and welcome to this discussion about alternative protein. And I think when we talk alternative protein, is an alternative to traditional meat, I guess, right? So, I mean, for me, it's not alternative. This is what I do every day. You know, we work with plant-based proteins. So I have with me today Kenneth. Kenneth is an advisor to food companies. I have with me Michelle. And Michelle, she knows a thing or two about alternative protein, and she have a project going where she introduced alternative proteins into especially the African market, and she's going to tell us about why that is important. And then I have Wendy. Wendy, she runs a micro ranch, and micro because she's farming insects as an alternative protein source. And then I have Cecilia, who is farming water lentils, and it's quite an interesting story about how they came across water lentils. It's kind of nature that kind of showed the way, and why this is an amazing crop, right?
Yes, so. It's funny because the company that I work for actually started off in the renewable technology area, and they were trying to make biofuel out of algae, and in open hydroponic ponds, up a couple of hours north from here, and. So they were trying the hardest, but every morning there was this little weed that covered the whole pond, and then they shoved all the weed out of it, and then the next morning it was all grown back again, stopping the sunlight to get to the algae, which of course means that the algae just cannot grow. So they did that for a few weeks, and then they figured out that, okay, so if we can't beat them, join them. So then they started, okay, what can we do with this little plant? And how can we make biofuel out of this little plant instead? It's the world's smallest flowering plant, and it's called water lentils or duckweed. And so they threw out the protein until there was a new management come in, and then they suddenly figured out that, okay, well, we'll skip the whole fuel thing, and we'll start make food and attack the environment in the food security system instead. So that's basically the beginning of it.
I like the story. It just proves how nature kind of offers itself with solutions to problems that we have.
Yeah.
So on a day-to-day basis, I run the Meatless farm in North America. We produce plant-based foods, and we do that because we believe by giving people an alternative to meat products, we can help them to, reduce the CO2 footprint, and so we help people do good for the environment, and therefore we all benefit from that. So yeah. And I think one of the things I was, a little bit puzzled about here, says here that we have to cover how consumer demand for protein is changing, and sometimes I wonder if it's actually the consumers asking for this, or is it us trying to push our products to consumers? And I know you, Kenneth, you know a little bit about consumer behavior. So is it actually true that consumers are demanding this?
So it's interesting. The consumer in recent years has shifted a bit. There's some ironies here, right? Mainstream food is very cheap, but we've also had a rise in obesity and diabetes and heart conditions. Healthcare spend is just out of control, at least in the United States, continues to rise. So when you think about food as medicine or food as a basic input to better health, I think most of our mothers and fathers taught us about a vegetable-based, eating your vegetables and fruits, nuts, a very balanced diet. So I think part of that is going back to that. Another part of it is really values, and there's a few different aspects of the value. My family and I went to Costa Rica a few years ago. We visited a farm in Costa Rica, and my daughter and I were sort of looking at the cows and the pigs, and she just said, "Dad, I don't want to hurt animals anymore." She was about 12 at the time, and said, you know what, from that point forward, she became a vegetarian. So her values, honoring the values of animal welfare and just respect for animals was part of it. And then there's another part of it as well, which a lot of people here, we've talked about climate smart agriculture, we've talked about being respectful of the environment. So there's a lot of truth to reducing meat once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week as a means to help the water situation, because a pound of beef takes many gallons of water versus a pound of alternative protein. So I think there's a cross current of a lot of trends. Plus, who doesn't think it's cool to be a flexitarian?
Yeah, no. A lot of people certainly think that, and it's actually a real thing. People have come up to me and identify themselves as being flexitarians. So it's something that people are proud of, and it makes me happy that it's something people think about. How can each individual help make an impact as such, and talking about the water usage, it is enormous, and we made some studies that shows that by changing just 1 pound of ground beef into 1 pound of our product, which is meatless, plant-based meat, then it's the same as taking a 20-minute shower. So it's not small numbers. So and we heard about how Airbnb has introduced meatless. I don't know if it was Monday. That's a big thing in Europe, at least meatless Mondays. But any given day, and how they, I think, was 60,000 pounds of beef that they're not using every quarter.
I thought that was a terrific example of Airbnb at least bringing that idea to the forefront. And what I like about that is a fewfold. There's a multiplier effect of positive action, and by really doing something that, aside from the one person that was on the meat-only diet, didn't follow, there's a very large impact with a very small sort of personal sacrifice. So I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
There's a number that I always quote, that if beef were a country, it would be the 3rd country of carbon emissions in the world, after America and China.
Yeah, that's quite staggering.
Quite big.
And Wendy, when we talk about protein, how does those numbers stack up, from eating beef versus eating insects?
Yeah, it's a really interesting comparison, but if I might really quickly, I'd love to ask a question of the audience, just by a show of hands, not counting the little snacks that I brought. How many of you have eaten insects on purpose before? Okay, and how many of you did that in the US? Okay, yeah. That's pretty consistent with my results. Thank you for participating in my research study. So like many animal forms of protein or food, insects vary pretty widely by their nutritional components. Crickets are one that are probably the most well-known and the one that we benchmark a lot against. If you're using crickets as a powder, then you're getting about twice as much protein as beef. But the micronutrients are where things also get really exciting. There's as much B12 as salmon, as much iron as kale or spinach, and as much calcium as milk. Additionally, there's a preliminary study showing some prebiotic effects of eating crickets. So the nutritional benefits are pretty exciting. And then layered on top of that, we have our environmental benefits, which are really based on feed to meat conversion ratio, and it's lovely to be in a room where I don't have to really explain what that is. But if, crickets in particular, and most insects are really efficient at converting feed into meat, and it's looking like it's going to benchmark pretty well with poultry, which I think is a very good starting point because the poultry industry has had about 50 years of R&D to get to those efficiencies. So but it's a very early stage in terms of understanding what impact we could really have, whether we're feeding insects directly to people or whether we're feeding them to the animals we eat as feed, which is a whole nother interesting topic.
And what do you feed them when they grow up?
Well, not to plug my micro ranch, but we're one of the only farms in the U.S. that's using a portion of the feed to the the feed for the insects is spent brewing grains, so it's pre-consumer food waste, and it gives us a little bit more environmental gains if we're able to use food waste as opposed to like grains that could be fed to people. So
using food waste to grow bugs that you can then eat.
Right.
So,
yep. Yeah. And with another species that's primarily used for feed, black soldier fly, which is probably some of the largest insect farms in the world at this point, they're only feeding food waste. And in some projects in developing countries, they're using them in sanitation, so like toilets, basically. So they're feeding them that kind of waste, and then they're able to feed the larvae to chickens or pigs and that kind of thing. So there's some really interesting applications, I think.
So it seems like you're saying there is a demand for this, and it's certainly more sustainable than some traditional farming, you know. So what we have
we grow these little water lentils in the open hydroponic ponds. The reason why we do it actually is because they double in biomass. They've adapted as asexual form of reproduction, so they clone themselves every day. So they double in biomass every day, and we harvest every day. And it turns into a yield per acre or per hectare, which is at least 10 times higher than any other crop out there, which is amazing because obviously the more you get per, so we can basically say we're zero footprint food. And also when you take the little, I had the edamame for lunch, so I was looking into the soybean, and actually if you take the nutritional content of the soybean compared to the water lentil, it's pretty much equal. We've got a higher levels of essential amino acids and protein, and we have about 45% protein in our starting material. So the actual use of that could be similar to soybean. And we believe that, with this whole new plant-based, the growth in plant-based foods, that there's already supply constraints, and we're already engaged with a lot of the multinationals on that. So we hope that we're going to be expanding here in Florida, especially because there's a lot of orange groves that aren't being used. So farmers are very happy to lease their land to us here.
Okay, and this is a good area too.
Yeah, very good area, because of course we need the water to be able to be water neutral. We got a certain amount of transevaporation, and we need precipitation because we keep the water in the systems, of course. So it's just like a recycling situation. We recycle 98% of the water that we use, so all the nutrients and the water gets recycled every day. So we don't use much of any, actually, and the process is minimal, so there's nothing really. It's actually kind of, the Gates Foundation said to us that we've made science fiction into reality. We're basically cloning food here. So that's pretty cool. It
sounds like the perfect crop in many ways, and I'm sure that it's going to be implemented.
Yeah, it's an exciting time for us.
Yeah. And Michelle, would that be something you could use in Africa for your projects?
I mean, maybe at some point. So, as you know, I have my feet in a number of different alternative protein or alternative food camps. I have my overall company, Excite, is a mission-driven project development, business development firm, and we invest exclusively in ag and food tech projects focused on Africa and frontier markets. And we have 3 businesses that we have incubated and built in this space. So we have a fresh produce business. So there was a lot of discussion both yesterday and today about hydroponic farming. So we have built so in my Whole Foods plant-based foot, we've built a hydroponic farm in Botswana where we have basically completely transformed the supply chain for delivering fresh produce to consumers, including nutrient-rich leafy greens and other foods. And effectively, we grow within 15 miles of our consumer. We've taken almost all the carbon and cost out of transportation. We've reduced nutrient loss by 30%. We've reduced food waste by about 60%. And we pick fresh to order every day and deliver to customers every day, and employ about 85 people in rural communities in Botswana. And then in the alternative protein space, we have Infinite Foods, which is a go-to-market platform for the emerging plant-based protein brands to reach Africa faster and with lower risk. So we represent brands like Beyond Meat and Oatly and Miokos, and we're enabling them to reach the 1 billion consumers in Africa and the growing tourism market by providing them a complete portal into Africa and helping them enhance their revenue and enhance their mission of feeding the world. And then we have a third company, which is called Crossover Meats, which is based on a patent where we're able to blend chicken with less environmentally friendly meat like beef, pork, and lamb to create a ground meat product that is all natural, clean label, minimally processed, and is completely indiscernible from ground beef or ground pork. But the beautiful thing about it is it's 50% better for the environment, and in most markets, about 20% less money. So instead of being 3 times more expensive, it's actually 20% less. Yeah. So I've got a foot with the meat eaters, I got a foot with the alternative protein players, and I've got a foot with the plant eaters.
It sounds like it's also probably less sodium and trans fat versus a pure beef.
So it's trans fat free.
Great.
And has no added sodium.
Very interesting. I would particularly like to hear more about why it's so important for you that that we need to bring plant-based foods to Africa.
Well,
or other developing
we've been
countries.
talking a lot about.
We talked about.
Yeah, we've been talking about that. There's going to be 10 billion people on the planet by 2050, and that our current agricultural practices cannot keep up, and we cannot produce all the food that we need and still have a planet to live on. But if you look at where that growth in particularly protein consumption is coming from, it's not coming from California and New York and Miami and Europe, right? It's coming from Africa and emerging markets, particularly in South Asia. So this is where, yes, in America, we're some of the largest per capita protein consumers in the world. And if you look at our 325 million people times our per capita consumption, it's a very, very big market. But we're not really growing in terms of protein consumption and population per se, compared to Africa and South Asia. So Africa is growing at 2.25 times faster than the rest of the world. People are moving into the middle class, and so it's kind of a natural evolution of a local diet that would be primarily carbohydrate-based, not very diverse. People love meat, but they can only get it sometimes, or they can only afford it sometimes. You're looking at an environment where we really can help Africa leapfrog from to a plant-forward, plant-centric diet, and bypass a lot of the health issues that you've just talked about, which include, heart disease, diabetes, obesity. And if we're going to do it, we need to start now. So, the strain on the healthcare system in 2050, if it's coming from Africa and Asia, then we need to find solutions for Africa and Asia now. And so that's why we're focused with Infinite Foods and with Crossover on serving the African market, educating the African consumer, getting these products and great brands into the hands of consumers, building the buzz around them, and then ultimately leading down the line to localized manufacturing where we can do further work in agricultural transformation.
Oh, that's interesting.
Kasper, could I react? Yeah. I love that. I feel an obligation, though, of being a tourist and an opinionated guide to sometimes level the playing field a little bit. So with the UN and their projections, first of all, I don't know if all their projections are accurate, but they are what guides a lot of people's thinking. I love the idea of producing food more locally for the growing population, because today, I don't know if the number is, I think the ReFed puts the number at 40% of food waste. So when you think about the insanity of population growing X percent and having to produce 70% more food, this is our friends at the UN, by saying we have to produce 70% more food, it's already factoring in 40% food waste. That's insane. Yeah. So I just wanted to, it's not a plug for me, but it's a plug for, as we help the world, I think wasting less food can go a long way. And the environmental impact of food rot in landfills is gigantic. It's probably as big as just the normal footprint of meat. And then one other thing I just also feel obligated to say is that, thinking through these issues, I think carefully, it begets another question, which is, the funny thing is, the richer people get, the more their habits get bad. They waste more food. They're not as respectful as, so it's the curse of becoming wealthier and the emerging middle class. So, my hope, and I've said this to friends at the Gates Foundation as well, is my hope is, as you bring people out of poverty, don't let them accept or adopt our bad habits. Have them be more respectful and thoughtful.
Yeah. So, and I think that's exactly why we're representing brands like Beyond and Oatly, because They taste great. They've got cool brands. They appeal to the everyday consumer. And we feel like by introducing these brands and starting to educate the populace around the value of plant-forward diets, plant-centric diets, that we can really move the needle. Yeah. And to your point around agriculture production and loss, I mean, Africa, frankly, we have massive issues, right? We have really bad cold chain and distribution issues, and a lot of produce is lost in the supply chain. But we also don't beneficiate. So, more than 50% of the world's cashews are produced in Africa. And yet they're usually sent to Vietnam for further processing, for shelling and selection and pasteurization. Then they're shipped to California, right, where they're made into cashew butters and cheeses and milks. So, why do we do that? Why do we add all that carbon? And, these are smallholder farmers. Had a funny story. I was talking. We're brokering some of the U.S. side manufacturers directly with these cashew producers, and one of the manufacturers said to me, they said, "Well, are these cashews organic?" And I had to kind of laugh because the farmers that grow these cashews are so poor they couldn't possibly afford fertilizer, right? So by definition, they're organic because they don't use anything on them. No. But there's those types of opportunities that I think that we have to look at the whole global supply chain. I think sometimes we get very myopically focused on what sits between California and the Eastern Seaboard. But I actually think we have to look at the whole global supply chain. We have to figure out how to reconfigure that supply chain so that we're maximizing the value that exists across the world.
We spent at Parabel, about a year in Uganda, and because actually, obviously they grow a huge amount of food in Africa, but what they don't grow is grains because it just doesn't have the climate for it. So they import a lot of grains for their animals, obviously, and a lot of the things that they lack actually is protein. They need aquaculture. They've literally stopped the aquaculture in Lake Victoria because they can't afford the fish meal because the fish meal price has gone up. So we had a system in there to try to create that, make our food, and we can, and we do, and we will. But the problem is that the systems over here, including the United Nations, the way that they buy and purchase and acquire all the food is so set in old ways. They fly in live turkeys from Brazil. I mean, can you imagine the footprint of those?
I don't want to be on that plane.
We had a system just next to the airport, and we saw these 747s flying in every single day, and we were just like, hang on, it's less protein than we're growing right here, but they can't change it. It's like it's such an inertia in the way they're thinking. And then, there's so many things to do, and we ended up going back to Florida. It grows perfectly here, and we'll be supplying the Beyonds and the Impossibles and all of these people that will then ship the food back to Africa. And it's kind of, like you said, it's a waste. Obviously, the other thing is, which is pretty cool, is that it's vertically integrated farm. So we don't ship, loads of moisture around the world. It's dried down to like 7% moisture. So it's like 93% food, rather than, in the other systems we just ship around food, water all around the world.
Yeah, no, I think it's all about limiting, that footprint is something, I work a lot with at the moment. How do we set up production where we actually need it? So right now, I'm not very proud of this, but we produce everything in the UK, and simply because we don't have necessarily the scale at the moment, we are looking for someone to produce it here, and we can then use, locally sourced ingredients to produce it here. And that also, comes back to what you're talking about, Michelle, about, we have all these great products that are good for the environment, but then we move them halfway around the world. And I guess I would think both for Oatly and for Beyond and someone like us.
Our objective ultimately is to be able to manufacture locally under license from the manufacturers, and that then allows us to trigger certain agricultural transformation and pull farmers into the supply chain, which is really important. I mean, in Africa, we're sitting on 25% of the world's arable land and only 10% of the yield. And land ownership, earlier they were talking about land tenure, but land ownership is a critically hot topic right now. in South Africa. There's, every day is discussions around land reform, around redistributing farms from white farmers to black farmers. It's a heavily politically charged issue. But the challenge is, so fine, you transfer land, you transfer farms, paid or not paid, to a new young farmer. What is that farmer going to grow? If they continue to grow the same things that they're growing today, they're just going to sell into a cartel that's going to put them out of business. Yeah. So if we can use this whole plant-based food movement as a catalyst for very positive change in the agricultural system, we think that's really important. As much as we've talked about agriculture here today in the US, I mean, the US agricultural system is not really designed to shift on a dime and say, oh my gosh, maybe we're going to eat all of our hamburgers made out of peas and our eggs out of mung beans. Mm-hmm. Let's shift from growing corn, which we get paid on the ethanol market, and start growing peas and mung beans instead. We're not structurally set up to do that. And so we see this as a great opportunity to use this whole movement as a really positive catalyst to change the agricultural system using these technologies in a way that really beneficiates the farmers and helps improve livelihoods.
But don't you think that's going to change? I mean, if consumers are really demanding that, there's going to be a growing need, to grow these kind of crops. And I think by time that will, hopefully that will level out. So there's going to be new incentives put in place for people to grow crops that are, better. And Wendy, could you see yourself having a insect farm in Africa to help them on their need for protein?
Well, it would actually be a more appropriate place in some ways to have an insect farm where it's culturally appropriate to eat insects. And most insects that are eaten outside of, that are eaten in places where people actually eat them by choice are wild caught. So yeah, no, and there are a few projects that are going on through different UN agencies and a couple universities in sub-Saharan Africa that are focusing on farming insects. And I know that insects are often kind of an outlier, and I'm always happy to literally be in the room with this topic. But I think one thing that we really have in common with a lot of the companies or organizations that are focused on sustainability is that we are trying to shift consumer demand a little bit, as well as, in a way, kind of be ready for a changed landscape for what we'll have to farm with, both on arable land, on water use, and all of these different issues. Yeah. So a lot of it is sort of preparation, I think.
I think that's one of the reasons why we're so excited about what we're doing on crossover meats with the chicken beef blend and the chicken pork blend, because the consumer data that we've seen says that people don't buy on environment, right? I mean, people buy on quality, they buy on price, they buy on convenience, and the environmental impact is somewhere down, number 5 or below on the list of values that most consumers use to purchase a product. So with crossover, we can, you can't beat them, join them, right? So give the people what they want. If people want real meat, they want all natural meat, they want minimally processed food, they want clean labels, they don't want allergens. Right. We can deliver that to them. And oh, by the way, we happen to be saving 50% on the carbon footprint and helping save the planet. What's important is we're delivering a great tasting product to the consumer that is affordable and appeals to what they want to buy.
And it's also taking a balanced approach, right? My same friend at the Gates Foundation, V. Shukla, talks about how she grew up in India and coming to the United States and having the pleasure and the ability to eat meat is very important to her because growing up she never had that. So having that balance, I think, is wonderful, and it is amazing just having at least a more balanced diet or 50-50 or mostly plant-based with meat occasionally. It is amazing the multiplier effect positive on the environment.
Perfect, and I think we have to finish this discussion now. I think you hit it right there. It's all about the balance, and I think we have, as both consumers but also companies who operate in this field, we need to understand that we can find that balance, and we just have to all do a shared effort to get there. And by doing that, then we'll get there. We're not gonna destroy the planet just yet, hopefully. So let's work together. Everyone to get a better world.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
everybody.
All right, thank you, panel.